Over the course of the last year, I covered some truly weird disappearances that have taken place across the United States of America. In this video, I've handpicked a few cases that I've covered previously that managed to baffle everybody involved. This one's over an hour long, so grab a hot drink and let's begin. Samuel and Susanna Cox were born in May 1815 and November 1827 respectively, and both grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. They married in their hometown in 1847, and shortly thereafter they welcomed their first two children, George and Joseph Cox, who are central to this whole incident. The family were not doing so well financially at the time in Pennsylvania, so in 1851 they decided to move to Indiana. This, as it turned out, was not a good idea, according to Charles McCarthy, who documented this entire incident in his book, The Lost Children of the Alleghenies, written in 1888, and he pointed out that parts of Indiana at the time were suffering from an outbreak of malaria fever. This is something that the family would actually contract themselves, and for many weeks afterwards was suffering quite badly. Thankfully, they all made a full recovery and decided to move back to Pennsylvania, where they would settle in Spruce Hollow, building a cabin of their own there in that lonely spot in the forest. Spruce Hollow is a rural community southeast of Pittsburgh in Bedford County. It is situated not far from Pavia within the Allegheny Mountains, which are a part of the Appalachian Range. Once they'd finished their cabin, Spruce Hollow quickly became their home, and their lives and health began to improve. McCarthy noted that George and Joseph were happier than ever and loved their little retreat in the pure mountainous air. For 5 years, they lived peacefully and happily in that cabin, but this happiness would be disrupted in 1856 when an unusual event occurred. It was the morning of the 24th of April that year when Samuel was having breakfast with Susanna, George, Joseph, and their two other young daughters, Sarah and Anna. At this point in 1856, George was 7 years old and Joseph was 5. They all heard their dog barking from a distance, and Samuel went outside to check. He estimated that the barks were coming from around 200 yards away from the cabin, but this wasn't too unusual. The dog, whose name we don't know, often chased squirrels up the trees, and he'd usually bark while doing so, which is what Samuel thought was going on. The barking continued throughout breakfast, and Samuel went out to retrieve their dog, leaving Susanna, the girls, George and Joseph alone together. Samuel reached the dog and didn't really understand what it was barking at, so just thought nothing of it and took it back home. McCarthy notes that Samuel hadn't taken the same route back to the cabin as he had heading towards the dog, perhaps taking a longer route to tire the dog out a little bit and give him a good walk. Whatever the case may be, we don't have a timescale of Samuel leaving the house to reach the dog to returning home. However, when he and the dog did make it back to the cabin, he greeted everyone, but he quickly realised that George and Joseph were not present. He asked Susanna and the girls where they were, but Susanna said that she hadn't noticed them after they left the house just after Samuel did, so she thought that they were with him. The pair came to the conclusion that the boys had likely tried to follow Samuel to the dog, but they had missed one another as Samuel took a different route back to the cabin. Outside the cabin itself was cleared land, as Samuel had chopped down many of the trees to build the cabin. At the edge of the cleared land was thick tree line that hit in every direction, and now they were panicked as they had no idea in which direction they'd gone. They first searched this plot of land, which was obviously small in comparison to the entirety of the woods surrounding them. This search failed, and then they took the path that Samuel had initially taken to the dog. The parents, in the wildest alarm, ran to the mountain and taking in as much of it as they thought it possible for their children to have reached in so short a time. They made the most careful search without finding them. Samuel and Susanna were in panic mode, and they ran into the woods in various directions away from the cabin, calling out loudly for the boys. But weirdly, they never heard a response. After these failed searches, they wondered if the boys might have just turned around and gone back home. So back to the cabin they went, but there was no sign of them. Out of desperation, the couple ran to their nearest neighbour's property and told them what had happened, and from there the news spread outwards like wildfire. People were on horseback heading to nearby settlements to gain more support, and an absolutely enormous search was being organised as more and more people joined. There ended up being over 200 people from the local area that made their way to Samuel and Susanna's cabin, and from there the search parties headed out into the forest. The sheer amount of people present was obviously a great sign for the family, as the odds of finding them had now improved drastically. Although the locals knew very well that whatever was to be done to find them must be done quickly, or the boys would likely not be found at all. With this shared urgency, farmers left their ploughs in the field, shopkeepers closed their stores, and workers halted their jobs. These people hurried to the mountain as they knew well that overnight the temperatures would be bitterly cold and likely not something the boys could endure. The searchers were right too. As the night approached, it grew cold quickly, and dark, heavy clouds were looming in the sky to the northwest, indicating that they were in for a very dark and stormy night. Samuel, who had been searching all day, was now worn out and pleaded with the neighbours to stay and search throughout the night. He expressed his concern that if the boys weren't found swiftly, they would fall to animal predation or exposure as heavy snow was set to fall. Selflessly, many of the searchers agreed to stay, and they remained on the mountain all night, braving the now stormy weather. In preparation for this, they had set up campfires at different points on the mountain, hoping that George and Joseph would be drawn to the warm glow. Sadly though, the boys didn't turn up that night. This left searchers feeling somewhat confused, as they had disappeared so completely in such a short amount of time. This search was thorough, and in a reasonable distance to the cabin, they had gone over all of the plains, all of the hilltops and ravines without finding even a single footprint. McCarthy gave a description of the boys. The boys were very innocent and interesting. George, the elder one, 7 years old, had dark hair and blue eyes, while Joseph, the younger one, aged but 5 years, had light hair and grey eyes, and owing perhaps to their sickness in the west, they were small for their age. George was remarkably intelligent for one of his age, and always had such a care for his younger brother that when going to and from their play, he nearly always led him by the hand, and they were so affectionate with one another that they never had a quarrel at their play. Because absolutely no trace had been found at all on the first day and night, those present realised that they needed more numbers, and people travelled on horseback again to gather more people for the search. At some point on the second day, there was somewhere around 1,000 people present on the mountain looking for them. There were people searching new areas that hadn't been searched before, while others went over already covered ground to see if they'd passed over them. This day was extremely cold and damp, and there were thick heavy clouds ready to dump more snow on the mountain, and the winds coming from the north were piercing. People knew very well that this was not looking good, as George and Joseph were not dressed appropriately to withstand such conditions. McCarthy describes that as the day went on, hundreds and hundreds of people were seen coming from every part of the country and entering the forest on that mountain. There were so many people there that it was stated that every adjacent hill, thicket, marsh and cliffs were searched, but still absolutely nothing was being found. The searchers were all shouting out for the boys, but nobody would ever hear a response. And now for the second time, the freezing cold darkness was approaching, and still there was no trace. Even more people stayed out in the wilderness for this second night, and now there were even more campfires scattered around. The night passed, and another day, the weather still inclement, and what was remarkable in this case, as the prospects of finding the boys grew less hopeful every day they were lost, the efforts and exertions of the people to find them increased each day until perhaps there were 2,000 people on that mountain. This search had truly started to take on an absolutely enormous scale, but despite having around 2,000 people on the mountain, they were finding no trace of either George or Joseph. It was at this point on the third day, the 27th of April 1856, because nothing was being found, a man by the name of Charlie Ross decided that something was just not adding up in this situation. Charlie did not understand how they could have disappeared in this manner so quickly, and started to wonder if the parents were responsible for this. Charlie drummed up some support, and in front of many, with his supporters, accused Samuel and Susanna of being responsible for the disappearance. Charlie and the others burst into the family's cabin and searched the entire place for the boys. They pried the floorboards from the ground in search of them. They practically ripped up the cabin and garden, believing that the bodies may have been hidden or buried somewhere. This went on for a while, but the accusers didn't find anything to pin it on the parents.
It seems that they then got a bit paranoid and worried about what the other searchers might have thought about what they'd just done, so they fled the area and left the search effort. Things were now just awful for the family. Not only were their 2 boys still missing, now the entire cabin and garden had been ransacked. It's important to highlight here that as time went on, the temperatures had been consistently cold throughout each day and even colder during the course of the nights. There was some good news though. There were rumours that spread across the mountain that they'd finally discovered a trace of the missing boys. A hunter about 10 miles away from the cabin had found their little footprints, all 4 of them, just seemingly having walked around that area. Because of the way that people were positioned on the mountain, this news actually spread quickly and made its way back to Samuel and Susanna in no time at all. Hundreds of people, including the parents, travelled to this remote spot with the strong belief that they would now soon be found. From the point of the footprints, searchers had spread out into groups and entered into the tree line in every direction. McCarthy stated that because of the find, there was a new vigour to the search and people really did believe that they were going to bring these boys home. However, despite the sheer amount of searchers at the site, they found nothing else that day. The footprints petered out, offering no more clues, and their journeys into the tree line from that point uncovered nothing at all. There was also confusion displayed at the sheer distance that the boys had travelled, with some questioning how they'd managed that in such rugged terrain and harsh weather conditions. But nonetheless, the parents were encouraged with this news and believed that they may still be alive. As night set, once more campfires were set up all over this new area, and McCarthy noted that since George and Joseph disappeared, the strong winds had not let up at all, making the point that it was as if nature itself was set against them. At least, that was the case until around the 5th day of the search, where McCarthy stated that an eerie stillness and silence was present on the mountain. He said that the only thing that broke the silence was the occasional howl of a distant wolf, or the scream of a wildcat in the darkness. There were a lot of rumours, debates, and discussion about what had happened. People were arguing that they surely must have succumbed to animal predation or the elements by now. Others believed that they would have found evidence of this in terms of finding remains, and because they had not, could have meant that the boys were still moving around up there. Other people believed that they may have been taken from the mountain by opportunistic people who had passed by them, and others believed specifically that they may have been stolen to be converted to another faith. There was also the suggestion that they might have fallen into the stream at Bob's Creek and passed away beneath the cold water. There was, of course, no evidence for any of this, and these speculations were a testament to how unusual this whole incident was. Everyone seems to have been of the mind that George and Joseph should have been found by now. Now, we have to get to a little bit of weirdness. McCarthy made the point that up until this time, the search had been systematic. Perhaps not quite as organised as they are today, with professional search and rescue teams and all of the specialised equipment we have now. But each day, someone that knew this mountainous area well would be appointed as the leader of the search effort. This leader would then organise the various groups, and this was an extensive effort. Thousands of people had searched all of the fallen trees, the base of every rock, and the mountain streams had been gone over, and nothing was being found. There were very few areas now that hadn't been gone over at least once by people standing shoulder to shoulder, or at least a small distance from one another. The scale of this search makes this next finding all the more unusual. On the 5th or 6th night of the search, a woman by the name of Bentimer, who lived near the foot of the mountain, had a chilling experience. The exact placement of her cabin is not known, but while inside during the night, she described hearing the cries of a young boy coming from the woods outside. It was a late hour when this occurred, but she went out and did make an attempt to search but found nothing. She called out for whoever this might have been but had no response back. She managed to carry this news to some of her neighbours, and a vigorous search was made, but to no purpose. It is supposed today that this woman really heard the lost boys cry, but by the time the people got to the place, the boys perhaps had cried themselves to sleep. McCarthy then stated that these cries had been heard in an area that had been gone over time and time again by hundreds of people. The boys were not found that night, and further repeated searches of the area proved fruitless, and no more sounds of distress were heard. Now, after word had spread about what had happened that night, the area was just flooded with searchers who desperately wanted to bring the boys home. Now we take another unusual turn. Because nothing other than some lone footprints had been found, and now this cry also leading to nothing, some of the searchers began to feel that there was something unnatural about this disappearance. Some of the searchers left on horseback to reach out to a man who lived nearby who was known to be a dowser. A dowser is a person who believes that through divination they can locate things buried underground. This might be water, precious metals, gems, and perhaps bodies. To be clear, this is a pseudoscience and there's no empirical evidence to suggest this works, but some people even today practice this. This man lived in Morrison's Cove, and he came out to Samuel and Susanna's cabin. Using sticks and other such things, he performed his routine and identified the direction he believed that they'd travelled. He believed that using this method he could locate them, and so off he went with his own search party. I don't think this worked out too well though. The man was very confident, as well as those who had brought him onto the grounds, that he could soon lead them to the lost children. It did not require long, however, to discover that he and his peach tree limb were a fraud, and had it not been for those who were with him, he would have been lost on the mountain itself. Or in other words, he was not able to find George and Joseph, and was then in the process of getting himself lost. I can understand why the searchers might have resorted to this though. It had been about a week at this point, and it seems to me that they were just pretty desperate to find them. Anyway, after that failure, some of the searchers still thought these unconventional methods were worth pursuing. So with that, they reached out to a self-proclaimed witch who lived in Somerset County. After being brought to the mountain and performing some rituals, she told everyone that she knew where the lost boys were and that she could see them plainly. She told the family and the searchers that George and Joseph were far out in the interior of the mountain, alive and subsisting on chestnuts that had fallen over the winter. She said that they'd been sleeping on a bed of leaves beneath a large tree that protected them from the elements. She then told the searchers that she couldn't find the boys unless she was given some money, so that's not really a great sign, is it? But her demands were met and she was paid to find them. She told the family that she would have the boys back by 10 AM the following morning, and so off she went with a group of searchers. Well, it got to 10 AM and she hadn't found them. Then each further hour that passed, she just kept pushing the time to find them back an hour until it got late into the night. She kept saying that she'll find them soon enough, and the following day that carried on up until noon. At noon, she said that she was feeling ill and needed to go home. After these failures, the search continued on using conventional methods until the 10th night of the search, where something unusual would happen again. So let's get bizarre. A farmer by the name of Jacob Dilbert lived about 12 or 13 miles away. That night, he went to bed as normal, but in the morning, he claimed to have had a very odd dream. In this dream, Jacob stated that he was walking through an unfamiliar forest and came across a deer carcass. Beyond the deer, he continued down a trail and then found an abandoned small shoe befitting a young boy. He continued and came across a large stream, which he crossed at a narrow point over a beech log. Then he travelled over what is known as Blue Ridge and entered a ravine where a small brook was present which came out of one of the mountain gorges. He followed this brook a short distance and came to a large birch tree, which at the base sat the bodies of the missing boys, just laying still beneath it. At this point, he woke up abruptly and was amazed at how detailed the scene was from the dream. Jacob had heard of the ongoing search 3 days into the effort and thought that probably influenced his dream that night, and so he thought nothing more of it. Jacob was known as an intelligent man and he wasn't very superstitious, so he dropped it. He did have a conversation with his wife about it though, who was brought up in this area. She told him that such a location that he described did in fact exist on the mountain, but even so, the matter was dropped. At least, that was the case until the following night, where Jacob explained that he had the exact same dream as the night before. He didn't want to gain a reputation of being called crazy, and so he didn't bring it up to anyone. However, after the dream repeated one more time, he said that he had to satisfy his curiosity. The problem was that outside of his farm life, he didn't have much experience with the forest, and thought that he would get lost should he venture out there alone. Before we go any further, I did just want to say that I've covered probably hundreds of disappearances at this point over the years. And one thing I did realise a while ago is that I've actually covered a number of these cases where the missing was found by someone claiming to have dreamt of them. I put a compilation together on this topic, which I'll link at the top right now and in the description below if you'd like to open a new tab. To be clear, I don't really have a horse in the race as to whether there's more to these dreams than we actually realise, but it's an interesting component of some of these unusual cases nonetheless. Anyway, Jacob confided this to his brother-in-law, Harrison Wysong, who did know how to navigate the forest, and thankfully lived a bit closer to Samuel and Susanna. Harrison thought Jacob was nuts, but he did humour him as Jacob was persistent about it. Jacob told him that he believed that the area in question was around 5 or 6 miles away from the family's cabin. Harrison told him that the place he was describing would have been basically impossible for the boys to have gotten to as it's over Bob's Creek, and the boys wouldn't have been able to cross it. McCarthy stated, "None of the searchers had looked for the boys on the east side of the stream. None supposed for an instant that they could have crossed it without being drowned." Despite telling Jacob that he was nuts, Harrison couldn't dissuade him and decided to tag along with him, as he knew full well that if he went alone, then there'd be 3 missing people on the mountain. I'll let McCarthy explain what happened next. Paraphrased, I quote, "Going in the direction by Jacob, they passed by a deer carcass, to which Jacob stated, 'That's just as I saw it in my dream.' Further on, they found a little shoe which had been worn by the younger of the brothers. Then they came to Bob's Creek. 'This is the beach log where I crossed the creek,' Jacob said. As they passed along, the route seemed as familiar to Jacob as if he had been over it many times before, though he had never been there except in his dream. Passing over Blue Ridge and to the ravine, down which the mountain stream flowed, and down this stream, the woods became more open so that the travellers could see some distance ahead. Jacob again told Harrison that this was just as he saw it in his dream. They then continued walking and came across a birch tree, and lying beneath it were the emaciated bodies of George and Joseph, just as he had seen in his dream. During McCarthy's research into this incident in 1888, he was able to make contact with Jacob Dilbert's then wife, but now Mrs. Sarah Gardner. She provided some context, first clarifying that Jacob had since passed away. He'd become a soldier and made it to the rank of corporal, but took his final breath during a conflict at Point of Rocks in Virginia. She stated that they heard of the boys' disappearance on the 27th, which was 3 days after they vanished. She described that the news had saddened Jacob and that he wished he could be of help, but as we've mentioned, he was not so great in the woods. It seems that this experience with the dream and then finding the boys had a profound effect on Jacob, as people thought that he was crazy. Jacob and Harrison had found the boys' bodies on the 15th day of the search, the 8th of May 1856. By this time, there was about 4,000 people who had been on that mountain searching for George and Joseph, and around 11 AM on that day, the word had spread round the mountain and people had learned of their fate. There were a number of doctors present on the mountain who had volunteered to join the search just in case the boys were found and needed medical attention. Of course, nothing could be done now, but a group of physicians did travel to the scene to get an idea of what had transpired. It was noted that in the place that the boys had been found, there was nothing that they could have eaten to stay alive. The physicians suggested that it's likely that the pair had succumbed to starvation at that spot. They detailed that the bodies had scratches which was consistent with wading through the thorns and thickets of the mountain. Their clothing was torn and their shoes, which were found separately away from them, were worn through. The physicians said that it was evident that they'd wandered over the rocks and wilds of the mountain until they'd been worn out from fatigue. They also estimated that it was likely that the boys had passed away just 3 or 4 days before being found. So they might well have lived until about the 5th of May, which is just a terrible shame they were found too late. The bodies were placed on a sled and then brought to Samuel and Susanna, and shortly thereafter, according to McCarthy, one of the largest funerals in that area occurred, seeing over 5,000 people attending the service. Jacob was given a reward of $50, which is just shy of $2,000 today. However, he didn't think it was right to keep the money, so he gave it to the parents so they could buy a gravestone for the boys. There is a monument in the area today at the spot that they were found, which reads, "George, age 7, and Joseph, age 5, wandered from their Spruce Hollow home on April 24, 1856. Hundreds of people searched for them for 2 weeks without success. Jacob Dilbert, a local farmer, had the same dream 3 times about where the boys could be found. On May 8th, Jacob and his brother-in-law, Harrison Wysong, set out to follow signs in his dream. A deer carcass, a little shoe, a log across a stream, and then a birch tree with a broken top. They found the boys' bodies nestled in the roots of the birch. This monument marks the spot where the boys were found. Samuel and Susanna ended up remaining at that cabin and would later have more children together. So, what actually happened here, and how did the boys come to pass away in the manner that they did? That is where a lot of people split into various camps and place blame on different people. You can see why this might be the case too, because in the end, you have two young boys that disappeared without a trace for 15 days. All the while, they were evading 4,000 people who were spread out on the mountain. Then, in another bizarre turn, a man comes forward claiming to have dreamt about them, and then he went ahead and found them in the very spot that he claimed they would be. So firstly, the location that the boys were found beyond Bob's Creek. This threw a lot of people off because the boys were very young and small at the time, they wouldn't have weighed very much, and Bob's Creek has a strong current and it produces waves that are around 3 feet tall. This, to practically all of the searchers, including their parents, made it an impossibility that they could have crossed it. This led some to believe that Jacob himself had something to do with the disappearance in the first place. You can see why some might have leaned that way. It's awfully strange that someone claimed to have a dream where he saw the boys' exact resting place and was then able to travel straight to it. I don't really know what to think about that. As mentioned before, I have stumbled across this very topic accidentally quite a few times over the years, before realising and putting together that compilation about others who had found them missing after claiming to have dreamt about it. In fact, that very thing happened to Nicola Bully if you've seen my coverage of her disappearance fairly recently. I didn't actually mention it in the video itself, but the person who found her claimed to have dreamt about finding her. Anyway, the point being here is that it's difficult to know what to do with that information, and like many of the people who pointed a finger at Jacob, I can see why they would have done that. Let's be honest, it's incredibly suspicious and just weird. It is important to note though that Jacob had no relationship at all with Samuel and Susanna. They'd never met before and didn't know about one another's existence. According to Jacob and his wife, they only learned about the disappearance 3 days into the failing search effort. It's also worthy to point out that Jacob lived around 12 miles away and was not a woodsman, and that's quite a large distance when the only mode of travel you have at hand is on horseback. Is it possible that he could have stumbled upon them out in the woods? Sure, but it seems rather unlikely to have occurred given that he wasn't able to navigate the forest alone. But at the same time, if he did not come into contact with the boys, what do you make of the supposed dream then? Did he make that up? He did find them in a place that no one else thought to look. He knew full well that opening up to people about this dream was going to make him look nuts, and he expressed that to his wife and Harrison. As said, it also draws suspicion, so if he was responsible for this, why would he tell people about the dream? It seems like if he had been involved, he'd have just stayed quiet and nobody would ever have known, even if the boys ended up being found sometime later by the actual search effort. I'm not convinced that Jacob was involved in foul play because the condition of the boys and their clothing was indicative of them indeed being lost and spending a lot of time wandering around in the wilderness. Their clothes were torn, the shoes were well worn, and the bodies were covered in scratches. There is plenty of vegetation on that mountain, including thorn bushes, so it's not hard to imagine how they might have been in that state. Lastly on that point, after the physicians had looked them over, they concluded that in all likelihood they had passed away 3 or 4 days before being found, likely from starvation. If there was evidence of foul play at the scene, it would have been mentioned, and let's be honest, that information would have spread like wildfire. Because that wasn't the case, I can only assume that the physicians had not seen any apparent or suspicious injuries. Another camp of people, like Charlie Ross from earlier, also believed that Samuel and Susanna were responsible for the disappearance. At that time in 1856, they lived in an incredibly remote place. If they did have the intention of committing such an act, then in all likelihood they could have gotten away with it handily. The technology we have today, such as DNA testing or thermal imaging cameras, was just not available back then, so they would have been able to blame it on anything really, considering where they lived. We've already talked about the condition that the boys were found in, so at a glance it seems unlikely that foul play had occurred. I haven't spoken too much about this, but Samuel and Susanna also had the 2 girls along with George and Joseph, those being Anna and Sarah. Susanna was also pregnant at the time of the search, so the family were obviously looking to extend, making it even more unlikely that they'd want to harm their boys. One accusation that was thrown around was that the family might have been struggling financially and wanted to reduce that strain. But while literally populating the family with more members, that doesn't seem to flow very well. When the boys vanished, Sarah was 4 years old at that time, and many years later in 1931, She was interviewed by a reporter from a local news outlet who asked what she remembered. She described that even at 79 years of age, she could still remember that day vividly. She said that her parents were in a state of absolute shock and panic and were rushing around desperately trying to find the boys. Sarah recalled that the neighbours were all a considerable distance away and were all spread out, and Samuel was sprinting to reach them. There was also a third camp of people that are less mentioned, and this group was a little different because they weren't trying to pin the blame on a person, but rather they were of the opinion that something else, something out of the ordinary, had happened to the boys. People pointed to the folklore of the mountain, which is said to be a place where strange things occur. If you're familiar with Skinwalker Ranch, there are similar such tales about the Alleghenies. In the folklore, you find mention of shapeshifters, or skinwalkers, I suppose. The Iroquois, among other tribes, spoke of encounters with these things that could turn into animals, or more ominously perhaps, turn into other humans and hide amongst them. The Native Americans were also said to have placed a curse on the mountains as a result of conflict between themselves and the European settlers. As the settlers encroached on the land and various battles broke out, in response, the shamans were said to have cursed it in retaliation. This curse was said to manifest in various ways, such as causing natural disasters and such things. But also, perhaps more relevant to this case, to cause bad luck and misfortune to those inhabiting the land. It seems like this group of people took these matters quite seriously, and really did believe that the disappearance was very much out of the ordinary. I suppose, through their lens, you can see why. You have thousands of people on the mountain that can't find anything. They find some footprints in the middle of nowhere that seem to belong to two young boys that again led nowhere. You have a woman who believed that she'd heard the sounds of a young person crying in this place, in an area that had been repeatedly searched, and then was researched again afterwards, and still nothing was found. I suppose today there might be those who look at this disappearance through the lens of a missing 411 case, since there are some hallmark profile points here. Firstly, while they were together, you still have the separation from others in a very remote and rugged location, which is typical of a 411 disappearance. You have the immediate unusual weather conditions, in the sense that right after the disappearance, the search was hampered by sudden inclement weather, including heavy clouds, strong winds, storms and snow. There was the fact that there was no immediate trace, despite a relatively large amount of people searching for them quickly. Speaking of which, the search escalated to over 4,000 people who really produced no results at all. They just couldn't find the boys. You have some baffling details and odd circumstances thrown in there, like the dream element, which crops up from time to time in 411-like disappearances. In addition, you have the boys' ability to evade all of these people for so long, the fact that they found footprints miles from their home, and cries were heard that all led to nothing. Occam's razor, though, perhaps would suggest that this was nothing more than two boys who tried to follow their father into the woods to reach the dog, and then proceeded to get incredibly lost. I'd be interested in hearing if you've heard of this case before, and also what you make of it. Which camp do you find yourself in?
That's about the extent of the information that I could find on this, so with that being said, let's move on to the next disappearance. Sandra Johnson Hughes was born on the 26th of July 1966 and was 54 years old when she went missing in the Sierra National Forest located in California in July of 2020. Before the global event of 2020 with lockdowns and such, Sandra lived in Hawaii, but that year, perhaps because of all the craziness that was happening, she moved back to the mainland, settling in California just a month before her disappearance. Sandra had been described as living something of a nomadic lifestyle, in the sense that she'd travelled the country and lived in various places over the years. She hadn't lived in Hawaii long enough for her to consider it home, which is a good thing I suppose, as that must have made it easier to move to California. For all of us, especially at the start of 2020, this was a deeply concerning period of time, and we were quickly learning that quarantine and the virus itself weren't going away anytime soon. Sandra was thinking carefully about how she wanted to handle this situation while still living a fulfilling life. Her life had not gone completely to plan up until this point. She'd been through 2 divorces and didn't have any children, but she was known to love the outdoors and was a seasoned camper and survivalist. She was very fit for her age and would go on frequent solo hikes in remote and wilderness areas, so this was an activity that she had a fair bit of experience in. Speaking of which, during her college years, she placed a focus on outdoor recreation,
which was her passion, and I believe she wanted to become a park ranger. This didn't really work out, but thankfully she was an intelligent person that had a skill with maths, so became an accountant. From what I can gather, Sandra seems to have been very much the kind of person who was highly independent. Given the state of the world at that time, and all the restrictions that were in place, after sorting out living arrangements and moving into a new home, she saw an opportunity and decided that it was the perfect time to go on a solo hiking trip. From her perspective, this was a great chance to break free from the reality of lockdowns and constant worry, to getting back out there and embracing nature. Sometime in June, she had sold her home in Maui and finalised her move to her new home in Madeira. This brings us to the 26th of June that year, when she called her family on the phone and told them that she was going on this camping trip in the Sierra National Forest, and potentially hiking all the way up north towards Yosemite. She then told them that she'd be back in touch with them in the coming weeks after she was finished. The actual date that she'd entered the forest is not clear, but at some point after this call was made and her plans were laid out to her family, she'd packed her camping gear and drove to the Sierra National Forest. She'd gone fairly deep too, as she'd passed the Fresno Dome area. Beyond that, she eventually came off and onto a rough, uneven trail that snaked through the woods until it led her to Johnson Meadows. There's no wonder why she might have chosen this place. It's a picturesque spot where beyond the field it's bordered by dense forest, and in the distance there is a great view of the mountains. With this kind of environment, it doesn't come without its risks. Outside of the meadow, it's a very rugged area, and because of how remote it is, there are known to be bears and cougars that live in this place. After parking the car, she got out and collected her things and began setting up camp somewhere in the meadows. Again, it's not clear exactly when she entered the forest and when she set up camp. We only know that it was either on or sometime after the 26th, but the Madera County Sheriff's Office received a report on the 2nd of July that a group of hikers had found an abandoned campsite at Johnson Meadows. This group had been hiking the area and they noticed the camp, so wanted to give whoever it belonged to some privacy and gave the site some distance as they travelled around it. But someone in the group noticed that it looked like it had been abandoned, and so they headed over. This campsite was none other than Sandra's. The tent was described as being only half set up or had collapsed for some reason, and her camping gear and supplies had been strewn around the place. It was just an absolute mess, and although this group didn't really know what to think about this, thankfully they did understand well enough that this visual was unusual and worth reporting to the authorities. It's not clear what they might have been thinking, perhaps an animal could have gotten to it or something else, but they weren't sure. The sheriff's office came down on that very day, the 2nd, where they found the camp and came across personal belongings and identification that had also been scattered around. So then they made contact with Sandra's family to explain what they'd found. In their official reports, they noted that the campsite was in disarray and bags had been emptied and that it was just an overall mess. The timeline of this incident is also a bit of a mess online, as various sources have reported conflicting dates, but I've done what I can to try and piece it together. During the conversation between the authorities and Sandra's family, they learned that Sandra was an environmentally friendly person and was very neat, organised, and had a great deal of respect for nature and the outdoors. So everyone knew well enough that she wouldn't have just left a place like that for no reason. Rather, something must have gone quite badly wrong here. The family also told the sheriff that they hadn't heard from Sandra since the phone call on the 26th of June, so everyone involved had absolutely no idea where she'd gone from the meadows. The missing persons report was now officially in, and a major search operation had been launched to get in there and bring Sandra home. Over the course of the next 2 days, there were hundreds of people that entered the forest performing grid searches. Helicopters fitted with thermal imaging cameras were placed in the skies above and search dogs were brought in. Now, on the 4th, 2 days after the scene at the camp was discovered, there was a definitive, positive sighting of Sandra. This would mark, potentially, the very last time that she would ever be seen. Now, there is some confusion around this sighting, as many claim that it occurred around Johnson Meadows, but this seems to be wrong. The actual position of this sighting was the Chiquito Pass trailhead. Now, this is Chiquito Lake, and this is the very spot that I believe she was seen. Whatever the case may be, there were oddities to this encounter. The group of hikers stated that she was barefoot and had a bruise on her face. She was wearing a black shirt and blue jeans, and this group had stated to the officers that they offered her assistance, but she declined. They said that she was just standing around and wondered if she was waiting for someone. They said that she didn't appear to be distressed, and aside from the bruise, there was nothing apparent in the way that she was acting that made them feel like she needed help. I can imagine that from their perspective. As far as they were concerned, they just came across a person that was minding her own business, and so they continued on their way. Now, this wasn't the only unusual report, and as said, there is some confusion surrounding the timeline. On the 5th, authorities discovered that Sandra's car, a silver Saab, was on a stump in a ravine approximately here, 6 miles north of her abandoned campsite. Now, because the car was found on the 5th, some believe that it also crashed on the 5th, the day after the sighting by the hikers. However, it appears that this crash likely happened the day before and still on the 4th, before she was spotted at the trailhead. Various sources mention that a park spokesman said that Sandra refused assistance from other motorists, though it's not specifically stated that anyone had seen her crash. The series of events happening in this order may also help to explain the bruising present on her face. Whoever had been driving the car, Sandra, I assume, had not been driving recklessly at a high speed, but rather the car had hit the tree at a speed of less than 20 miles per hour. After the collision, the car slid down into the ravine. Again, while this could have resulted in the bruising to her face, it's not immediately clear that the speed of the impact led to any significant injuries beyond that, as there was no evidence of that left behind in the car. We know for a fact that the airbags did not deploy, so the accident is likely not to have been high impact. And again, from what has been said, 20 miles per hour is the absolute maximum speed it could have been, so it may have been a bit less than that. So, to try and get this in order, it seems that the camp had been discovered on the 2nd, then days later on the 4th. I imagine first she struck the tree with her car, again perhaps resulting in the bruising, and then a short time later being seen by the hikers wandering at the trailhead, now barefoot for some reason. Given that appears to be the case, the unusual behaviour and weirdness actually seems to have started on the 2nd, or sometime before that even, with her campsite. It's not known how long her campsite had been left in disarray and abandoned before its discovery. It's not even clear that Sandra herself was responsible for the mess left behind at the camp. Could there have been a person who held particularly bad intentions that drove her out? Could an animal have caused her to flee? It's just not known. We know that Sandra was a neat and tidy person. She had a lot of experience in wilderness areas and she knew what she was doing. So how did the camp become to be in such disarray? The world was a crazy place at that time. Could it be possible that it affected her quite badly and she had suffered from some kind of mental break? She could have made her way to the parked car from the campsite, still suffering from this break, drove north while being completely disoriented, hit the tree, and then wandered out again into the wilderness. It's not really clear what was going on there. Or as others have mentioned, you could look at it another way. A separate event took place at the campsite that caused her to flee, whether an animal or something else. She scrambled to the car as the campsite was being torn through by something, and then she drove 6 miles north and hit the tree. I'm not sure that's really the case though. If Sandra had been threatened, or felt threatened, it would have made far more sense to have driven south in the direction of her home, not further north and deeper into the forest. Now, it's important to note that none of these people who'd seen her on the 4th, that being the motorists nor the hikers, realised that anyone was missing in the area. However, the group of hikers that had spotted her at the trailhead later realised that she'd been reported missing days before once they reached the car park after their hike was over. When they got there, they'd seen the missing person flyers that had been put up that very day containing a picture of Sandra and explaining that she was missing. I'm sure at that moment it must have clicked, and they realised that the woman with the blue hair who was just standing in the forest near the trail was Sandra Hughes. They then called the sheriff's office, which must have been great news to the sheriff all things considered, but when they got out there they weren't able to find her and there were no obvious indications as to where she might have gone. Now, back to the car. On the 5th, sometime during the afternoon, the sheriff's department confirmed that her silver Saab 95 was found in the ravine, and as mentioned, 6 miles to the north of the campsite. Similar to the campsite, when the authorities investigated the car, they noticed something unusual. Sandra's belongings had been taken from the vehicle and the items had been strewn around outside the car on the forest floor. Almost as if Sandra, or someone, had been rummaging through the car looking for something and throwing things out. Weirdly, this was a similar finding as to what had taken place at the campsite. Though again, what led to the campsite mess in the first place is not clear. In the same vein as my speculations about her state of mind at the time, the sheriff's office believed that she was not actively trying to evade or stay hidden from the police, but instead was probably highly disoriented. The idea that they were operating on seems to have been that the crash likely caused her state of mind at the time, and perhaps some kind of injury such as a concussion had impaired her cognitively to the point that she was not able to think clearly. You could dispute parts of that though. While obviously the crash cannot have helped the situation in any way, and to be fair, certainly could have made things worse, there was clearly something awry days before that incident as per the scene at the campsite. Now, it is possible that on the second, her state of mind hadn't deteriorated and she was in fact fleeing and fearful of someone, but there isn't any evidence of that. There were, and still are, discussions surrounding the involvement of foul play, but for the most part it seems that the authorities discounted them. Whatever the case may be, by this time on the 5th, a major search for her had already been underway over the previous days. The decision was taken to leave the car where it was, as this might have been used as a landmark for her to find her way. To help with this, law enforcement left instructions and important numbers for her to call for help on the windshield, just in case she came back. Ashley Marcus was Sandra's niece, and she was effectively campaigning online for support for this disappearance. It seems that she wanted Sandra found ASAP, and through social media was helping to keep the spotlight on the incident by providing updates and further information. She confirmed that both the state of the car and campsite was similar in terms of how dishevelled the scene was, in regards to her items being scattered around. She also confirmed that both of the scenes were highly unusual and completely out of character for Sandra, as litter bothered her, especially in areas like this. As you can imagine, the authorities, alongside professional search and rescue teams, first began to scour the area in the vicinity of the car, and then fanned out into the tree lines from there. This effort did actually uncover something around 2.5 miles to 3 miles north of the car. There, not far from Spotted Lakes, which is right on the border of Yosemite, they found a sleeping bag that they identified as belonging to Sandra. This discovery was made on the 12th of July, or 8 days after Sandra was last seen. This area was not easy to get to, there were no roads or trails in the area, and they wondered just how she'd even managed to traverse this kind of terrain. They said that it looked like the sleeping bag had been slept in recently, so they scoured the whole area around the sleeping bag and around Spotted Lakes. But the searchers, nor the dogs, or any other means at their disposal could find even a hint of her. The circumstances puzzled the searchers, who made a note of the fact that it's as if she'd been travelling directly north in a straight line towards Yosemite National Park, which she did say she might do in the phone call on the 26th of June to her family. They also realised though, that it appeared that she'd been travelling without any supplies at all, nor any shoes. This is important because it begs the question, once you've gone without your shoes, just how far can you actually get? Presumably, in rugged terrain like this, you might think that alone would limit your movement. There was an intensive search that went on for 7 days at the location of the sleeping bag, but after repeatedly finding nothing, on the 19th, the search was scaled down to a limited, continuous search. The dogs at no point found any indication of her scent anywhere. Other than the potential sighting of Sandra by the 2 hikers on the 4th of July, there were only 2 other reported sightings. The first one seems plausible but unlikely, while the second alleged sighting ventures into the realm of the extraordinary. The initial sighting occurred on the 9th of August, just over a month after her deserted campsite was discovered. 2 hunters were driving down this isolated road here, and as they got down there, they reported that they saw a woman alone, leaning against a tree along the road, close to Chiquito Creek and Portuguese Overlook. Meaning, if this was in fact her, then she'd somehow been alive for over a month without any supplies at all. Not only that, but from the point of her sleeping bag, she had travelled 5 miles back to the southeast, nearer to the sightings of her on the 4th of July. Now, these hunters knew that this was odd, because this was a very remote place and not somewhere you'd be expecting to see anyone. Some reports state that these men drove away not thinking anything was actually wrong with her, and others state that they tried to flag her down and speak to her, but she just ignored them and then they just carried on their way. Whatever the case may be, later on during the day, upon their return to town, they saw the missing posters picturing Sandra Hughes and immediately realised that Sandra was the person that they'd seen earlier. They were absolutely convinced that it was Sandra that they'd encountered in the forest. At that point, the hunters informed the authorities and told them what happened. They said that the woman did not signal for help, make eye contact, or look distressed. She simply appeared to be taking a rest, resembling a typical hiker on a break. They stated that she appeared noticeably thinner than in her last known photographs and seemed to be alone, without any gear. Strangely, it was also reported that the woman was wearing a floral shirt underneath overalls, meaning that if this was Sandra, she'd also somehow managed to change clothing, despite having left everything behind earlier. The Madera County Sheriff's Office investigated that location but found no evidence of Sandra's presence. All of the sightings of her were reported in areas affected by the creek fire that started on the 4th of September 2020 in Fresno and Madera counties, and the fire wasn't fully contained until late December. Officials confirmed that Sandra's car was not damaged by the fire and had been retrieved since it appeared that Sandra was not going to return to it, though the date that it was hauled away is not clear to me. If the hunter's sighting is to be considered credible, is it possible that she was living out there until the fires took place? If that sighting was in fact Sandra, it was around a month out from when the wildfires started, so is there a chance that she could have been around during that? Given the complexity of Sandra's last known whereabouts and the ruggedness of the terrain, the search efforts in the Sierra National Forest were immensely complicated throughout this entire effort. The forest encompasses over 1.3 million acres, and this vast expanse of land is both awe-inspiring and unforgiving in its various regions. Johnson Meadows, where Sandra's campsite was found, sits centrally within the forest. Considering just how large and dense the forests are, it's not a surprise that someone could become lost. However, in Sandra's case, it seems that there's more to consider. As we know, Sandra was described as an avid outdoor enthusiast and survivalist, including her studies to become a park ranger. She would have known not only how to stay safe in this kind of environment, but also how to navigate this type of terrain. While the sighting by the hunters seems credible enough, it still seems questionable. Surviving alone without gear, food or help, possibly suffering from a head injury for such a long time is unlikely. This sighting was truly baffling. However, it's not the strangest one, so if we haven't already, let's get bizarre. Fast forward a year to the 21st of July 2021, Jake and Victoria Gorber were visiting the Sierra National Forest with their 3 children. At the time, Jake had an off-road vehicle that he was using to traverse the steep roads in the middle of the forest, and they were heading to Shut-Eye Peak. This is a mountain that offers amazing views and is connected to its sibling, Little Shut-Eye Peak. As they were driving up the mountain, they decided to stop for lunch. Thankfully for them, they were able to find a flat portion of the road where they could relax comfortably for a while. Next to the road, there was a small meadow surrounded by dense forestry where they pulled over, and they were about to go have a picnic. As they were preparing to leave the car, Jake and Victoria stated that their 3-year-old son, Caden, was looking out of the window next to him in the back seat, and he began talking to someone or something in the direction of the meadow. He was just turned and facing towards the window, seemingly having a conversation with someone. Apart from themselves and Caden's siblings, there was no one else present, and the parents just stared off into the meadow, which was on the clearing on the mountain. The exact area is not clear, but this spot was about 5 miles south of Johnson Meadow. Initially, they dismissed it as typical toddler curiosity, and they carried on with preparing lunch. However, once they were ready to get out and go, they noticed that Caden was still intensely gazing out the car window, prompting Victoria to inquire about what he was looking at. She said, "Caden, who are you talking to?" What followed sent shivers down her spine. While pointing towards the meadow, Caden said, "There's a lady over in the meadow in a black shirt. She needs our help, but she's not alive, and she's lying face down with her legs up, and she can't talk to me, but she's over there, and we need to go help her." His demeanour and just how weird this was compelled the family to humour what was going on for a moment, but they told him that they couldn't see anyone out there. Caden told them that they needed to trust him and that this woman was lying face down right over there as he pointed out towards the meadow. Jake got out of the car to see what Caden was pointing at, and he had a good look around trying to search for this woman, but he couldn't find anyone. He came back to the car, and I get the sense that this just kind of unsettled everyone, and a sense of creepiness lingered in the air, prompting an early departure from their trip, and they drove back down the mountain wanting to be out of there. Victoria later shared the incident on Facebook, unaware of its significance to Sandra's case. Unexpectedly, the Madera County Deputy Sheriff, Chris Williams, stumbled upon Victoria's post, instantly recognising the detailed description of the woman as a match for Sandra. Victoria was taken aback when Deputy Williams reached out to her, but as she learned more about Sandra's disappearance, Caden's account began to align with the circumstances. Recalling Caden's uncanny accuracy in describing Sandra's appearance down to her distinctive blue hair, Victoria was astonished. She told WSET News he was very adamant that we needed to help her, and he described her right down to her blue hair. He said that she had a black shirt, blue jeans and blue hair, and that's the exact description of her when she went missing. The police gave Caden a lineup, and he was able to recognise Sandra in 3 of the 4 photos, identifying her as the woman he'd seen in the meadow. The following day, Caden and his father accompanied the county sheriff back to the mountain to investigate further. Despite their efforts, the search once again uncovered absolutely nothing, and even now years later, Sandra's final whereabouts remain unknown. There are a couple of hypotheses in regards to Sandra's disappearance and what may have happened to her. When authorities were conducting the initial search, based on what was found in the car, there was no evidence to suggest Sandra suffered a severe injury that would have led to her passing away there and then. They also noted her extensive experience in wilderness survival, leading them to believe that she was still alive and the search needed to continue on, which it did. Based on the various sightings, they still remained optimistic about her being alive, even towards the end of their efforts on the 19th of July. There isn't a lot of information regarding her family or what they thought might have happened, but one idea suggests that the events of 2020 and the isolation enforcement that was in effect may have significantly impacted her mental health. Early on, many people were uncertain and very anxious about getting ill, and what the severity of it might be. Is it possible that Sandra was experiencing personal or mental health issues because of this? Let's be honest, society was being constantly bombarded with a lot of bad news. I could imagine some taking this very badly. This is obviously all speculation at this point, but you could look to the unusual behaviour noted at her campsite and at the moment of the sightings where she declined help despite clearly needing it. This idea would then suggest that because of everything that was happening in the world, it could have caused her to suffer a mental break. It is possible, I suppose, that she might have become so fearful of becoming infected that she started avoiding people, possibly refusing help or contact altogether. For most people, we look back at that time and realise how odd it all was in hindsight and are able to move on from it. But at the extremes, we don't really know how badly it might have affected some people. It is possible that Sandra could be a case of this. Another popular hypothesis suggests, as law enforcement seem to consider, that her car crash had caused the mental issues that seem to be present in this case. The issue with that is that you then have to take the position that the state of her campsite is completely separate from the mental issues that she may have been having. As mentioned previously, the accident in the car can't have helped one bit, but that was not where this episode looks to have begun, as that was 2 days after the campsite discovery. Although with that being said, it could be that the 2 incidents are separate, as briefly touched on earlier. It could have been that she was in fight or flight mode and fled the campsite for some other reason that we don't know, or had just become hare at the campsite for some reason. One searcher speculated that she might have come across something that she was not supposed to see. This individual stated, "I participated in the search a few weeks ago. I'm very familiar with the area, having hiked it for years. There are numerous places where someone could easily get lost. However, many aspects of this case are just strange. I started to think she might have stumbled upon a grow operation and was disappeared. The crash and sightings could then have been a part of an attempt to sweep the incident under the rug to make it look like she'd just gotten lost. Apparently, there have been numerous grow operations in the area over the years. It wouldn't surprise me given the condition of her campsite and where her car was found." The problem with this is that based on the reporting, there are separate groups of witnesses, one of whom, a motorist or motorists, who had seen Sandra walking away from the crash site, and another group of hikers had seen her barefoot near the trailhead, who'd both seen her on the 4th of July. You would have to make the case that the motorist witnesses were lying, which doesn't seem to be the case. The group of hikers who'd spotted her barefoot were also deemed as credible. Not only that, but then you have to try and make everything else make sense around it. If this entire incident was as a result of Sandra seeing something she wasn't supposed to, and then said people caused her to disappear, why on earth would they go ahead and trash the campsite and the car? All that serves to do is to make the situation look more suspicious, and less like someone who just wandered away into the wilderness and gotten lost. Many people have since disagreed with that whole hypothesis too, arguing that grow-ups usually aim to stay completely under the radar. The idea being that if someone was to stumble upon them, they typically avoid confrontation rather than taking them and causing harm to them, which would attract law enforcement attention and jeopardise the entire grow operation. You could also add to that and suggest that the people involved in this theoretical growing situation would probably not then go ahead and contact the authorities themselves describing some intricate situation of a car crash they'd done themselves, and then also spotting her at the trailhead. Even if someone had done those things, it's difficult to imagine that they'd then go and talk to the police about it. Another line of thought that I've seen suggested was that her camp and her car could have been ransacked by opportunistic strangers looking for valuables after they were abandoned for a few days. Certainly possible, I suppose, but these are very remote areas, and for that to have happened twice, miles apart, I'm not sure. The final hypothesis suggests that she simply got lost and there was no third-party involvement, one person stated. This happened about 3 minutes away from where I live. Parts of the Sierra are rugged, rocky and dry this time of year. It's also a somewhat eerie area in my experience. According to a local news station, her personal items were found at Johnson Meadows. If she took the route I know through Fresno Dome, that's a remote area with narrow dirt roads. It's very isolated and not a popular spot. She could have easily gotten lost, especially since she had recently moved to California and wasn't familiar with the terrain. Looking at the map, you can see how remote it is. It's easy to get lost and not be found there. Every sighting that was reported of Sandra was plausible. Sandra had excellent survival skills and knowledge of the outdoors, so the reported sighting a month after her disappearance is also certainly a possibility. With the survival skills that Sandra had, she did have the know-how to survive for a month in the woods if she had access to water, which she'll have known how to find. The hunters also reported that she appeared thinner than in her photos, which would make sense if she'd been surviving for a month in the wilderness. However, what doesn't make sense is why she didn't call out for help. If you'd been in the wilderness for a month trying to survive, surely you'd reach out for help as soon as you came across another person. It's very difficult to imagine a mental break like this enduring for over a month without any interruptions at all, though not impossible, I suppose. You could also argue that maybe it wasn't a mental break, and instead she just suffered a quite bad head injury in the car, and now she was just deeply confused and displaying avoidant behaviours from which she was not recovering. Though again, the car crash came after the campsite abandonment, so you just run into the problem of trying to explain that, or I suppose have to reason that she had sustained the head injury sometime before the crash at the campsite. It's also worth pointing out that before her disappearance, Sandra made some big changes in her life in terms of the fact that she just had this big move to California. She'd also dyed her hair, which according to reports was unusual for her, and with the whole world going into chaos at that time, perhaps she was behaving erratically. It's certainly possible that she was in the midst of a breakdown. Again, this is all speculation, but her fundamental survival instincts could have still been functioning, allowing her to continue surviving out in the wilderness, albeit in a distressed, disoriented and confused state. The state of the campsite really confuses things here, because as gone over, you could make the case that when Sandra crashed her car, she perhaps hit her head, leaving her disoriented. She could have suffered a concussion, which could help to explain her behaviour. This, coupled with insufficient gear, a lack of adequate food and water, this scenario could be plausible. However, it's important to note that the authorities stated that the car had minimal damage, suggesting it had been travelling at a slow speed, likely below 20 miles per hour before colliding with the tree. The real problem though, is that you then have to come up with a different explanation for the campsite, because that was found 2 days before the crash. Perhaps, as per the bruising to her face, she was suffering from a head injury, but it wasn't caused by the crash. Could it have been caused by something that happened at the campsite? Perhaps she set up the campsite, something separate happened there which caused her to flee and hit her head? She got lost, but because of her skill set remained calm and then got to the car sometime later, but then crashed it while in this state of confusion. Given the bruise on her face, if this was in fact as a result of the crash or something at the campsite, she could have been suffering cognitively, quite severely, even without any visible evidence left behind in the car. If she wasn't wearing a seatbelt and collided with the tree at 20 miles per hour, the impact could have been more significant than we realise. Even without deploying the airbags, hitting her head on the steering wheel could definitely have caused a concussion or made a pre-existing injury worse. Building on that, maybe she did have the clarity to gather some essentials and a change of clothes, still intending to reach Yosemite. Even if her plan was irrational, she might have been operating on autopilot, driven by a pre-concussion plan that she came up with initially. She may have reached the spot where her sleeping bag was found, confirming that she'd been right at the border of Yosemite, at least at some point. Going back to the extraordinary for a moment, there is a lot of folklore and stories of strange activity within the surrounding area, with some locals believing the area is haunted. The Native Americans claim that the forest was inhabited by spirits and other such things. They describe that these spirits protect the land, and if they believe it's being mistreated, they become vengeful and will punish the person for their perceived mistreatment. There are also a number of Native American stories about lights being seen in the forest, which they interpret as spirits either leading someone to safety or astray. Whether you take this kind of folklore seriously or not, the experience reported by the Gorber family is certainly unnerving, but it could just be a case of a 3-year-old saying something weird, as does happen with toddlers. Obviously, we can never be sure, but it's certainly odd. It's important to point out too that very young persons don't tend to lie in the same way that older children or adults do. A more developed person can lie to deceive, while young persons don't really do that. Their lies are often more simple and based around wishful thinking. Like, a toddler might have cookie crumbs around their mouth, and when asking if they're the one that ate the cookie in a certain tone, they might deny it. It's hard to imagine someone that young concocting an intricate lie like this. Caden certainly seems to believe that he'd seen someone, or I suppose maybe it wasn't a lie at all and it was just some fanciful play on his behalf. Who knows? Either way, while Caden's account is undeniably peculiar and unsettling, the sighting reported by the hunters over a month after Sandra's disappearance is also bizarre. The hunters claimed that she was 15 to 20 feet off the road, staring into space, with no gear and no one around on a remote forest road. Authorities had been searching for her for over a month and had found nothing in regards to where Sandra might have gone. And yet, these two hunters reported seeing her east of where the car was found. How did any of this happen? If that was her, it's bizarre that she'd managed to evade the search parties for all that time. With a potential head injury, no shoes, no sleeping bag, food or gear, she then managed to travel another 5 miles south of where the sleeping bag was towards the observation site. It's unbelievable, and in the end, there are still many unanswered questions. Sandra is still missing, and to this day has never been found. What do you make of this?
I'm going to leave this one there. Based on all of the information that we have, it's easy to see why this case confused so many people. Now, let's explore the final disappearance. The Craters of the Moon National Monument and Preserve is located in central Idaho and would be the place that the two friends, Amelia Linkert and Joe Blakesley, would come to vanish from in 2013. This area is home to extraordinarily harsh terrain, spanning over 750,000 acres of rugged lava flows, volcanic cinder cones and lava tubes. The area was thought to have been created thousands of years ago due to a series of eruptions, giving it its seemingly otherworldly appearance. Today, it is cared for by the National Park Service and is one of the lesser known parks. However, getting lost or going missing in this particular vast and unforgiving landscape would not be a good idea. Over 300 caves have been discovered within its boundaries. Its rugged and jagged lava surfaces are incredibly difficult to navigate, and the lack of water sources make it all the more dangerous. Amelia was 69 years old and had retired 4 years prior to this incident in 2009. She was a middle school teacher who worked with those who had special educational needs. Joe, on the other hand, was a 63-year-old physician who lived in the Boise area and worked for the Oregon Department of Corrections in Ontario. The pair had met one another while doing voluntary work in Africa, and they quickly became great friends. 2 months prior to the disappearance, Amelia was visiting relatives in her hometown of Rosemont, Minnesota, where she purchased a camper van as a retirement gift to herself and was eager to go exploring with it. Which brings us to the events of September 2013. Amelia's 70th birthday was coming up on the 19th of September, and she and Joe wanted to spend some time together. The plan was to drive to the campground in Arco on the 14th, which is a small town around 20 miles to the northeast of Craters of the Moon. Amelia's younger sister described that she was very happy and excited about going on this adventure. But sadly, this trip would take a bizarre and awry turn. Together, they got into their vehicles and drove to the K-Away campground where they paid to stay for 5 nights. They wanted to relax and spend time in this remote place, and other visitors stated that Amelia and Joe, for the most part, just kept to themselves. They enjoyed their time together, and on the 19th, the day that they were due to leave, they first wanted to head into the craters of the moon. Sometime early that morning, the pair was spotted having breakfast together at the campground, and then they were seen again for the very last time at around 9:30 in the morning, heading out for the craters of the moon. They drove there in their pickup truck, and it's not clear exactly what time they arrived, as it doesn't appear that anyone had seen them enter or hike in the park itself. The timing of this incident was particularly unfortunate too, as nobody had noticed that they were missing until after the weekend. They entered the park, from which they would never leave on the 19th, which was a Thursday. Amelia and Joe were quiet people, and it would not have been unusual for them to have reached their respective homes and had a nice quiet weekend up until the Monday. Amelia was retired after all, and Joe had booked some time off work for that week that they were away and was due back on Monday the 23rd of September. Given her career as a physician, Joe was an incredibly talented person. She was well thought of, very intelligent and highly professional. She was not the kind of person that would miss work, especially without telling anyone. But as Monday rolled around, she failed to show up for work, and thankfully this immediately set off alarm bells in her employer, who began to call around. Nobody had seen Jo since her departure to Arco, and her employer got in touch with the Ada County Sheriff to conduct a welfare check on her home. Deputies travelled to Jo's address and knocked on the door, but they quickly realised that she wasn't home. Not long after this, the sheriff's office came to learn of their trip and realised that they must still be in the park. The Ada County Sheriff's Office then made a call to the Park Service and the Butte County Sheriff's Office describing what had happened. Their camper was found at the campsite that they'd been staying at, so given that they were supposed to have left on the 19th, it's a shame that no one from management had noticed sooner because the search had only just begun and they'd been missing for 4 days already. Shortly after finding the campsite, the authorities drove down to the beginning of Tree Mold's Trail. This trail was named as such because it features unique, hollow casts formed in the lava where trees once stood thousands of years ago. These molds are the trail's primary attraction, and many, including Amelia and Joe, were compelled to have a look. Right at where the trail begins, a parking lot is present, and there the authorities found their pickup truck. Inside the vehicle, their 2 dogs were still inside, thankfully alive as the windows had been left open, and there was now an empty water bowl inside, suggesting the dogs did have access to water, but it's not clear how long they'd gone without. It's important to state here that taking dogs down the trails in the park is prohibited, so to explore it meant to leave them behind. Those at the scene of the pickup truck also found personal belongings of the 2 women, including their purses and mobile phones. I'd imagine because of these factors, they can't have planned on hiking the trail for too long, so something must have gone badly awry here, though it's not clear what. The trail itself is said to be easy to follow and not very strenuous, which would have been perfect for Amelia and Joe. The surrounding area though is a rocky, broken lava flow filled wasteland that is incredibly desolate, very rough and full of caves, which is not the type of environment that they would have just wandered off into for no reason. Both of their families stated that they would not have gone off the trail or out of sight of the pickup truck, and doing so was completely out of character, as leaving the dogs behind, especially for too long, was not something they did. They might not even have realised that dogs weren't allowed on the trails until they got there. We know that they kept to themselves at the campground, so they might not have learned that information. On the very first day of the official search, the 24th, or 5 days now after they'd vanished, Dan Buckley, who was the superintendent of Craters of the Moon, realised that finding the missing women was not going to be an easy feat and was going to need some serious resources, so he requested that the Butte County Sheriff's Office take over, which they did. Dan placed the park staff under the command of the Sheriff's Office, who were now all directly involved in the search effort. At the beginning, there were 12 people searching, law enforcement and the park staff. Given that Amelia was 70 and Joe was 63, the thought process was that neither of them could have gotten very far. Plans had been drawn up that encompassed a 5 square mile radius around the pickup truck that covered multiple trails with a focus centered on the Tree Molds Trail.
Everyone knew that this was not going to be an easy search, and the moment you go off trail, things quickly get difficult. The searchers had to climb over rocks and cross the broken lava flows and the lava fields, but they weren't finding anything. They were instructed to check all of the caves nearby, and together they scoured this area for them, but nothing was being found. In the skies above, the Civil Air Patrol was conducting an aerial search above them, but like their counterparts on the ground, they didn't find anything. This actually led to some confused discussions, as they didn't understand firstly why anyone would choose to venture off the trail into this madness, and secondly, how the women could have gotten beyond their search efforts in this kind of terrain. These thoughts weren't unfitting, as Amelia's and Joe's family described them as very kind and positive people, but they were in poorer physical shape than they used to be. The pair of them did have a lot of experience in the outdoors, though walking long distances would not be something they were capable of, and Amelia walked with a limp. Nothing of note was found that first day. The search increased in its scope the day afterwards, and additional professional search and rescuers were brought into the park, though they didn't flood the area with people as they were anticipating the weather to worsen significantly with downpours of heavy rain. Because of this, the search needed to be surgical-like in its precision on the ground, as the area was dangerous already and was about to get worse. You wouldn't want hundreds of untrained volunteers trying to traverse this mess and getting hurt or lost themselves, which would have made the search chaotic. Because of the factors already mentioned, the searchers did not believe that they could have gotten too far away, and so the search area was not expanded, and ascending the large rocky surfaces was not something that either of them, especially Amelia, would have been able to do. The authorities were of the mind that they would not have intentionally moved too far away from the easier trail that they were on and into the harshness beyond. During an aerial search, a National Guard helicopter flying above the scene noticed something that stood out from the rest of the ground. Approximately 2 miles from the pickup truck, and over 1.5 miles to the west of the end of the Tree Molds Trail, a body had been discovered within a lava flow named Big Craters. Weirdly, this area was so off the beaten track that it was described as inaccessible, yet there the body was. She was found face up on the lava, wearing only a short sleeve shirt and pants, but without a jacket, backpack, food or water. Rescuers believed she became disoriented and possibly searching for help and passed away of exposure. Authorities did not suspect foul play. Initially, the searchers believed they had found Joe as there was no identification on the body, but dental records confirmed that the body was Amelia's. The coroner believed that because the weather had been bad in the area around the time they disappeared, the combination of being wet with cold winds hitting her, it was too much for her to endure and she succumbed to it. As said, searchers at the time thought that they'd found Joe's body and that Amelia must be close. Of course, we know that it was the other way around. But whatever the case may be, because of the condition the two women were in, authorities believed that they'd find Joe's body close by and quickly. However, despite searching the entire nearby area, they just couldn't find her, neither on the ground nor by way of the air. Given that the general direction Amelia was travelling was westbound, it's likely that they could hear the sporadic traffic coming from the distance as the highway is right there. It's bizarre how they'd managed to stray so far away from the trail, but then, once realising they were lost, they must have been trying to head towards the sound. But this is not clear, and certainly for them would not have been an easy feat. The terrain is so aggressive and rough that they would not have been able to walk in a straight line. Then, as the rainstorm closed in, visibility would have dropped significantly, leaving them stranded in this desolate area. Once heavy rain was pouring down around them, it's likely that it drowned out the sound of traffic. It's important to note that they probably couldn't directly see the highway either, so they would have been guided by sound alone, especially as it became dark. In any case, following the discovery of Amelia's body, investigators put 2 and 2 together and started flying over this westbound area towards the highway. Professional cave explorers were brought in and additional search dog teams entered the area also. Because of Amelia's discovery, the search leaders were convinced that Joe would be found, and quickly at that. However, despite the numerous dog searches, the dogs were just not able to locate even a trace of her. The search leaders also realised, and they'd likely thought this for a while now, that this was looking more and more like a body recovery mission, as by the 27th, the weather had continued to worsen and they didn't believe that she could have lasted this long. Then the search was hampered even further, as sleet, snow and fog prevented the helicopters from taking to the skies. Then came the next disaster. On the 30th of September, there was set to be a government shutdown which threatened the search, meaning that the park rangers and such would have to stop. However, the vast majority of the personnel involved volunteered to keep going. At first, it appeared that Amelia and Joe had separated, and the searchers had no idea why they would have done this. But then it was reasoned that in all likelihood they hadn't. Instead, it was reasoned that Amelia likely became injured or sick, and then Joe continued on westward to reach the highway to bring back help. However, for one reason or another, likely the onslaught of the rain, cold and wind, Joe was just not able to reach safety and fell a ways before the highway. The only problem with that hypothesis though was the fact that the dogs were just not able to find Joe anywhere in the area. Strangely, the dogs did get some hits, but each time led the searchers entirely in the wrong direction. The dog teams found it odd, as they expected to be led straight to her each time the dogs found a trail. The aerial search had also failed to find her, unlike Amelia's body. Still, believing that this must have been the case though, and Joe must have been travelling to the highway, the ground searchers doubled their efforts. On numerous occasions, they found footprints in this desolate area that they believed may have belonged to Joe, because they were so remote and nobody else was out there. But each attempt to follow the footprints only ended in failure, as they just petered out and the trail went cold. The dogs also failed to follow them. A month of searching would continue until a ranger spotted Joe's body from a helicopter on the 22nd of October. Their initial assessment seems to have been correct in that Joe had been heading towards the highway. Her body was found around 1.5 miles to the west of Amelia's body and less than 1 mile from the highway. Joe had been so close to safety but was not able to make it in time. Autopsy reports found that both Amelia and Joe had cuts and scrapes to their hands, knees and shins, which would have happened by slipping or falling onto the sharp lava, likely many times over. Travelling through this horrible terrain, they would have been freezing and would have known well that they were truly in a bad spot. There's not an awful lot more information aside from this though, so we don't know anything about what state Joe was found in. This means that we're left with a few unanswered questions. For instance, we know why the pair may have left their dogs in the pickup truck since they weren't allowed on the trails. But why would they have left their mobile phones in the truck? Family members from both sides have stated that was out of the ordinary and just odd. Did they just forget them? Perhaps they weren't expecting to have signal out there? It's not really clear. Secondly, why on earth did they leave the trail? General opinions from those who've been on this particular trail suggest that it's clear and easy to follow. Others state, as previously mentioned, that it's not too strenuous and that it's mostly flat. Because they left their mobile phones and dogs in the truck, we know for a certainty that they cannot have planned to go out there for too long. So how did they come to leave it in favour of the harsh terrain outside of it? There's plenty of people that state that it's nice and easy to follow. So despite that, was it an accident? Could there have been another reason? It's very unusual to have two people get disoriented at the same time and then leaving, as described, a nice well-groomed trail to venture out into what is essentially a dark, desolate landscape. The area was also described as inaccessible, yet Amelia and Joe had managed to cross these lava fields at quite a large distance. It's not really clear at all as to how and why they ended up where they did. To even get lost in the first place, they'd have to trek through some seriously harsh terrain, leaving only the question of why behind. Even from an aerial perspective, you'd have thought that the helicopters would have been able to see Joe sooner, given that the ground is just a dark grey. It's also important to consider that alongside their mobile phones, Amelia and Joe also never took any provisions with them. When each of their bodies were found, there was no evidence present to suggest that they'd taken any water or food, furthering the idea that this was just supposed to be a quick walk, which makes sense as the Tree Mold's trail is only a 2-mile hike, including the trip back. At the time of the disappearance, many people were puzzled as to how they could have been only a few miles off the trail, yet extensive searches took so long to find their remains. Though largely, that seems to be because at the start of the search was not located near the position of the bodies. Rather, Amelia's body was found by the helicopter. Secondly, as mentioned, the dogs led the searchers astray a number of times, so I can't imagine that helped. Additionally, the landscape was also not helping, as not only was it difficult and dangerous to traverse, there's a lot of ups and downs that would have obscured the body on foot, though likely not so much from a top-down view from the air. As already mentioned, the tree mold's trail is clear to follow, and, as corroborated by some of the reviews, you'd think that it would make it difficult to accidentally stray away from. While the authorities didn't publicly suspect any kind of foul play, is it possible that they were pushed from the trail? Perhaps not physically, as there wasn't any evidence of that as far as we know, but could they have felt threatened? This might not have emanated from a person, but rather, despite the appearance of craters of the moon suggesting a barren, lifeless wasteland, there are animals that do in fact live in the area. Now, most of the animals are not so threatening, such as wood rats, skunks, and many others. However, there are some that could pose a problem. Mountain lions are known to lurk in the area, alongside bobcats and rattlesnakes. It's difficult to predict the exact moment they might have strayed from the trail, but could it have been an attempt to evade or move around one of these creatures? Because they were found to the west of almost the exact end of the trail, is it possible that they did in fact reach the very end of the trail, then on their way back spotted a mountain lion or a rattlesnake or something of that nature? Perhaps instead of this being an accidental straying away from the trail, could it have been an effort to get away from this kind of perceived threat? Based on what's been reported on the clear and obvious nature of the trail, that's one of the only things I can think of that could be more likely than just accidentally straying. Although, if that was the case, wouldn't there have been evidence of animal predation left behind at the location of the remains? You'd think so. I suppose also there is a second option to consider. Perhaps there was no physical threat at all, but both Amelia and Joe underestimated the weather conditions at the time. We know that Amelia was wearing a short-sleeved shirt without a jacket. We also know that this area can get pretty cold, especially around the time that they were there. Could it be possible that the pair of them began to suffer from hypothermia as they reached the end of the trail? Could that have caused them to become disoriented at the exact same time, and then in absolute confusion wandered so far away from the trail? The third option to consider is the fact that in this area off the trail, there are unmarked tree molds to be found. Could it be that the pair felt confident enough in their abilities to go out and find them? This idea removes the threat, hypothermia, and accidental elements and would suggest that they had just overestimated the challenges involved in finding them. Although, in that case, you'd think that they would have taken some supplies with them because all of a sudden, their quick 2-mile hike was going to turn into something longer. And, given that they left their dogs in the pickup truck, I can't imagine that they'd have a change of heart at the very end of the trail and spend even longer doing something else. But, if this is in fact what happened, they could at some point have realised that they were lost and couldn't find the trail again. But hearing the sporadic traffic in the distance, just ended up travelling west towards the source. Obviously, those are just some speculations, and the truth is, we don't actually know where exactly or why they left the trail. Something that seems to have thrown a lot of people off was the lack of success in the beginning by the aerial searches. The areas that the bodies were found were not totally obscured and were visible via the air since they were both found in that manner. However, for Joe's body, it took over a month to be located. So what was the reason that she wasn't seen sooner? Was she not there initially? If so, could that imply that she'd been placed there sometime later? That's a difficult one. Occam's razor, I suppose, would suggest that she was simply missed by the aerial search crews. But people have questioned that, and let's be honest, that is a very weird element in this disappearance. Coupled actually with the fact that the dogs did find a scent lead numerous times and proceeded to take the search crews in the completely wrong direction. In hindsight, it does seem that the search effort was doomed to failure from the beginning. The search began 5 days after the pair had gone missing when it was realised via Joe's White Place. Given that kind of time frame and the weather present at the time, it seems unlikely that they ever stood much of a chance of being found in good condition. It was like a perfect storm of things going wrong that led to this outcome. Ultimately, we're left with a lot of questions that have not been fully explained. While we can speculate the precise sequence of events, the exact reasons for their decisions and actions remain unclear. What is evident is that the craters of the moon's rugged and remote terrain can present significant dangers, even to experienced individuals, and just underscores the importance of thorough preparation and caution in such places. So, if you're someone that loves to hike these kind of wilderness areas, please do all you can to stay safe and tell someone where you're going and give them a time frame.
With that, I'm going to end it there. What do you think happened here? If you know of a disappearance that you'd like me to cover, please do drop me a comment below. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. Please do remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and do drop me a comment as I read pretty much all of them. If you didn't like it, then feel free to give me a thumbs down. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. And remember, be safe guys. Peace.